out to join us today. So as Oliver mentioned, the subject of the webinar today is implementing your bring your own device / secure mobility strategy. So this is part 2 of a series. The first webinar we delivered several weeks ago was around how to develop your mobile strategy, and this is focused a bit more on how we actually go and roll this out in a real-world environment. There'll be Q&A along the way, but this will also be available on the Logicalis webpage for replay, so we hope you get benefit from it. Okay, so the agenda today, first of all, just going to run through and I guess show how we can identify some of the gaps and risks associated with BYOD, to sort of scare you all a bit first of all, before we actually then steer the ship around and actually start to focus a bit more on how we can do this in a secure and scalable manner. We'll look at some of the components that help us enable the policy. We'll also compare BYOD, which all of us know and love, with a slightly different approach, which is known as COPE, and we'll define that, and we'll also compare COPE with BYOD and see how it stacks up, some of the pros and cons. We'll look at mobile device management. Sorry about all the acronyms here, but in IT, of course, plenty of acronyms, but and secure mobility is no different. And then finally, we'll look at some attributes of an effective implementation and how we can actually measure that. What are the sorts of things that we should have visibility of, and data that we can access as a result of an effective implementation. And we'll have some web Q&A at the end, depending on how we go for time. Okay, so a couple of background slides here. Really, some of the big scary things are, according to Gartner and IDC and Forrester, any of the research analysts that you talk to today, is that the number of network devices that are out there in enterprise and in consumer land is still growing at an exponential rate. So mobile device growth rates are incredible, and we're scheduled to hit 15 billion by 2015. The other part of this is that 90% of organisations will be allowing personal devices of some form or another in the workforce by 2014. 56% of OECD information workers spending time outside the office, and that's also on the increase, and that would certainly tally with what I'm seeing here in Australia with my customers. An ever-increasing number of workers in the Australian enterprise space are wanting to work from outside the office walls. So you're either using a range of different technologies to do that, but in particular are wanting to use their own devices to do that. The net result of this is 100% of IT staff that you talk to are genuinely struggling to keep up with the demands placed upon them as a result of mobile devices. So a quick look back at 5 years ago. I actually went and talked to a customer back then around would they ever allow mobile devices, personally owned iPads, iPhones, to be used in their corporate environment. I was still on a BlackBerry at the time, had an iPod Touch that was sort of like could see the potential for it, and a number of people in that organisation were already asking IT whether or not they could bring their newly acquired iPhone 2Gs and 3Gs in, and the result was an emphatic absolutely not. So what's happened now, went back and talked to that customer several months ago, and really there's been a complete about-face in their attitude and their approach. Resistance is futile, and they really are having to support Apple and now Android products across the board. What we're also seeing here is that iOS is also changing a lot. Apple has got a much more enterprise focus in features that they're rolling into iOS. iOS 7 has got a number of mobile device management hooks in the operating system and capabilities. And this is also starting in recognition of the fact that these devices are being used in enterprise environments a lot more. And just one final slide from the previous session that I delivered. And one key thing here that we're starting to see is that the emergence of Gen Y in the workforce in Australia, and the fact that most Gen Yers just by their nature will not obey IT policies. They can say, oh yeah, we'll sign up for that and we'll behave and we'll toe the line, but when it actually push comes to shove, that they will still go and do what they like. In particular, if it's a personal device, they will have the attitude that, hey, it's my device, I'll do whatever the heck I want to on it. Thank you very much, Mr. IT department. And as a result, 60% of them will download sensitive data onto those devices. And that opens up an incredible amount of risk and security concerns as a result. Any CIO, any chief security officer as well, really is being challenged by this approach by the modern workforce. And as a result of the webinar we gave previously, there was this 5-step approach to developing a strategy along the lines of developing a business plan, working out what the categories of users are who will be using devices, so segmenting that workforce, applying services or SLAs to those various categories of users, and then working out what they will and will not be able to do, what sort of policy is going to be applied to them, and probably most importantly of all, how we actually support those users. So making sure that the help desk, that the support models that we've got are geared up to cater for this new approach, and also that we're using technologies that will reduce rather than increase the number of service calls that our departments have to cope with. Malware is another thing that's starting to proliferate, in particular in the Android environment. Cisco did a study several months ago that they released, which focused on Android and some of the security risks that are out there, and it really is starting to cause a number of vulnerabilities that have been identified that present major risks to enterprise IT departments. So Android malware is just proliferating, and that we have to be able to deal with that in a sensible way if we're going to allow these devices onto the corporate network and to manage them appropriately. So the security report was quite detailed, but one of the key takeaways from this is that BYOD and the proliferation of these devices can't be overstated. We can't just say no, they can't connect. We can't just deny them the ability to use them, but equally we have to look at ways and means of managing these devices in new ways and using new techniques, using new management tools in order to trust them and in order to allow users to store and use them for sensitive data. Right, so I'm an architect, and one of the key things that we use in our approach to solution design is a framework approach. So the ability to have order, to have structure a solution so that it will cater for not only existing needs but also future needs and growth in enterprise environments. What we see a lot is customers using an ad hoc approach where they will say, oh yeah, we need to have some authentication and authorization on the network for mobile or VPN devices, and then later on it's like, oh hang on, we also need to have an audit capability here so that we can track users and we have some form of evidence, legal evidence that we can use in a court of law should there be any unauthorized activity or malicious activity. Then BYODs come along. Things like guest access have popped up as well. contractors to have guest access, for example. The ability to try and posture assess devices and see whether or not they're compliant. All these things have sort of popped up, and if handled in isolation, then we end up with a very siloed approach. So my job is, as an architect, is to challenge customers and to get them to look at this more holistically, and in doing so, we can actually solve not only these problems, but also handle a lot of the challenges that lie ahead in the future. So what are some of the gaps and risks? Well, this is the scary one, and this is in effect an easy one. Do you have a corporate standard? Do you have a standard operating environment, or SOE? If so, how do you go out there and identify any device that you've got, whether it be a laptop, whether it be a pad or a tablet or a phone, or any other mobile device, or even a corporate desktop device? How do you actually go and work out what sort of operating system they've got? Are they patched? Do they have relevant service packs? Do they have other operating system patches? Have they got Java patches? Have they got Adobe Flash updates? There's a whole range of different things that potentially are the components of a compliant device. How do we manage those? How do we recognize those? How do we understand what users are, how they are connecting, how they are authenticating into the network? How do we control what they access once they have? How do they store corporate data on these devices in a secure manner? What happens if that device is misplaced, lost, or stolen? And then from an execution standpoint as well, how do we control what they have access to? How do we potentially wipe data in the event of the device being misplaced or stolen? And how do we look at some of the auditing capabilities that I mentioned earlier? So we actually have an audit trail of what it was that that device or user did whilst connected to the corporate environment. Okay, now once we move on, we can see, well, there's a number of components, devices, if you like, in our tool bag, in our toolkit that we've got available to us. So let's just look at those in a little bit more detail. That can actually help us to start to roll out and deploy and implement the policies that we've created. The first thing we can do is to say, well, what are the devices that are out there? And I've sort of split them up into two broad categories. They might seem the same, but they're actually fairly different. The first is the concept of a trusted device and understanding whether or not it is a corporate device, but not only the actual device, but the user who is actually holding that device and trying to access the corporate resources. Are they who they say they are? And if so, how can we get them to prove that? And then once they've done that and they're downloading data into the device, how do we actually secure that data as well and manage it and do it in a scalable way that works for us in enterprise environments? And there's a range of components here down the bottom which range from encryption of the actual information on the device, so that if it is stolen, that there's no way of easily compromising and viewing that data by unauthorized people. Another technique that we have is to enforce an automatic lock on the device. I've sort of touched on some of these elements in the policy development section of our first webinar. The implementation of a PIN as well, so that when the user puts their device down in a cafe and walks away for a few minutes and someone else comes along and picks it up and goes, oh, this looks interesting, that the device is automatically locked and that they have to re-enter credentials in order to gain access to that sensitive information. And then once the rightful owner of that device realizes that they've left said device in the cafe, but the IT department has the ability to wipe any corporate information that might be stored on that device. So this gets back to the exercising of policy. So these are all components that we've got out there to actually implement security in a BYOD environment. What are the key enabling technologies in all of this? Well, really at the center of this is what we call a policy engine. And what this does is take information from the clients, the users actually wanting to access corporate resources. It looks at who they are, who they claim to be, if you like, what they want to connect to, where they physically might be located, whereabouts, are they using a mobile network, are they on the corporate wireless network, how long did they want to connect for, when did they connect, and what type of resources are they endeavouring to use. At the other end of the spectrum is the actual business policies that we talked about in the previous session. So if you like, inputting those into a funnel, into the top of this engine that then processes them and looks at, okay, what are the users coming in? So all the criteria over there on the top left, and matching them up with our business policy to see, are they compliant? What do they want to connect to? And matching them against these policies. The policy engine processes this and then makes a decision to allow what level of access, say a certain level of access into the corporate resources. At the same time, the policy engine continues to monitor and report on these connections and the usage of data, and does so in a dynamic way. So the policy engine is pretty critical to all of this, and it forms an integral part of our BYOD solution. Now, at this point in time, I just want to sort of take a slight detour and actually look at the BYOD versus COPE models that I mentioned earlier. So bring your own device. Yep, everyone's pretty much across that definition. But one that you may not have heard of or may not be too familiar with is the concept of corporately owned, personally enabled, which is a different take on things. So rather than having users bringing in their own devices, that could be any type of hardware, any type of operating system, and any type of software and apps installed on them, it's the reverse approach, where the enterprise purchases a range of devices, potentially installs enterprise applications on them, and then gives them over to the employees to pretty much do with as they please, to still use them as a personal device as well. So that could be installing their own personal apps, photos, music, videos, etc., their own data on the device, but doing so in a way that gives more control back to IT. So BYOD has a lower initial cost to IT because IT is not purchasing those devices, the user is. But we've found, and there's a lot of studies out there that back this up, that show the longer term cost to IT is significant. And that comes through the support costs, the increased number of service desk requests from users who are having issues using their own devices in a corporate environment. COPE allows us to sort of do the opposite. So these are corporate assets. It's a corporate fleet of devices that the enterprise has a reasonable amount of control over. And I sort of flip it around and say it's the mirror image of what we do with BYOD. BYOD is a personal space, a personal device with a small amount of space carved out for enterprise use. And COPE is the opposite. It's an enterprise device with some space carved out inside it for personal use. And that's a way I find that is an easy way of thinking of it. So what does MDM give us? We talked about this before. MDM, mobile device management, is really an agent or a piece of software that's installed on the mobile device that opens up and gives the policy engine that I referred to earlier access to a lot more information as to the status of that device, what hardware it is, what software is installed, what patches have been installed, in particular whether or not the device is jailbroken, and this is something that is exclusively what MDM gives us. Nothing else but MDM can determine whether a device is jailbroken, and can then block or force remediate that user to fix up the device through a self-service portal before they can access corporate resources. And this really is, I guess, the other second major factor around MDM is it assists us in this automatic or self-remediation so that the help desk isn't bombarded with calls by users with non-compliant devices not being able to access the corporate network. A range of different vendors that are out there. I've sort of, with the policy engine, a solution that Logicalis proposes and has been, I guess, has a lot of experience with is the Cisco Identity Services Engine solution, which is comprehensive and actually works with a large range of MDM vendors that are out there. So moving along, the policy engine, as mentioned before, when it actually talks to, because it's tightly integrated and coupled with the mobile device management software, gives us additional reporting capabilities that we wouldn't otherwise have. And these are some pretty powerful things in terms of what the device is, the manufacturer, the model, the serial number, the actual version of software that it's running. In particular now, whether or not we are running MDM software on there, and whether or not there's encryption enabled, and whether or not the user has got a PIN lock enabled on there. Another thing here you'll see is whether or not the device is rooted or jailbroken. So really, really critical stuff on which we use the raw information that we use to base a policy decision on. So there's other cool things where we can actually look at failure codes to see why a device wasn't allowed on the network. So the help desk can actually be preemptive here and can actually ring the user and say, hey, guess what? You weren't allowed on the network because of this particular policy violation. Your phone may have been out of contracted, or you didn't have a password set on it. So really powerful stuff, but allows us to be preemptive in our policy enforcement. So just onto the final stretch here in terms of what are the 5 attributes of an effective BYOD implementation. In order to do so, we really just need to quickly define what a policy is, first of all. So really all it is a whole range of input criteria that we then use to determine an outcome. So when a user actually wants to access corporate resources, it's sort of like a flow chart to say, are they an employee? What sort of device are they on? Is it a registered device? Are they, seeking guest access? All this input data that we use to ripple through the flow chart and come up with a result, either no access at all, limited access, guest access, or full corporate access. So based on that, what we can then do is to say, right, once we've got these policies in place, we can then have a very granular level of detail and visibility on what's actually, who's connecting into our corporate resources. Effective attributes of a policy show us and give us visibility of who's actually connecting. Are they an employee? What department are they a member of? Are they seeking guest access? What device they're on? Whether or not they're a SOE device, a standard operating environment device, whether or not they meet that criteria or if they're non-compliant, device health, how they're actually connecting to the network. Are they doing that through 3 or 4G wireless, through the corporate wired network, through VPN technologies, or the corporate wireless network? All these different ways of visibility that we now have to implement policy become available to us. Their geographic location, where they are, what sort of wireless SSID, in effect the identifier that they're using to connect in on. How long did they connect for? And other custom attributes that we've got. So others really a 6th attribute that we have here. All this granularity that we have that we can use to implement policy become available to us if we do this correctly. So just in closing, we really go from, as I said, by taking an architectural approach, we go from this very ad hoc approach where we've been gradually bolting on bits and pieces, of components of a BYOD network that we need to have in place. And if we take a step back and we look at the big picture and look at what the longer term challenges are as well, we go to this, which is a heterogeneous approach that's actually integrated and gives us a wealth of different functions that we need to deploy BYOD networks in an enterprise environment successfully. So just in closing there, I hope you've enjoyed the session. Please feel free to pass on the link to other people as well. We'll be publishing this session on the Logicalis website, and as I mentioned before, the first episode of the webinar will be available for download and replay as well.